Contra Krugman, episode 202.
Welcome to the podcast that takes apart Paul Krugman's New York Times column. Join us as Tom Woods and Bob Murphy teach economics by uncovering and dissecting the arrows of Krugman, Nobel Prize winner, newspaper columnist, and destroyer of nations. It's time for Contra Krugman.
Folks, social media is a pit of misinformation when it comes to the subject of guns. So what you need is my free ebook, Your Facebook Friends Are Wrong About Guns. Smashes all the myths and a lot of fun to read. Pick it up at wrongaboutguns.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. Bob Murphy is out of town this week, but I have an outstanding substitute, and that is David Stockman, a former U.S. congressman, also director of the Office of Management and Budget under Ronald Reagan, and author of one of my favorite books of all time, The Great Deformation, The Corruption of Capitalism in America. Just a tremendous book on so many levels. And David is going to be this week's Bob Murphy. So, David, welcome.
I'm very happy to be with you.
So remember, my role in this is to kick the show off with a summary of the Krugman column we're discussing. So as a jumping off point today, we're using Krugman's August 15th, 2019 column called From Trump Boom to Trump Gloom. You can read it. We've linked to it at contrakrugman.com/202. I'm going to do a very, very brief overview of this because we're really just using this as a jumping off point for a broader discussion. But what Krugman is saying is that although the stock market sometimes gets things wrong. Like, let's say if you look at how the stock market is doing and you predict where the economy is going on the basis of that, you're going to be wrong as many times as you're going to be right, he says. But with the bond market, he says, well, the bond market sort of kind of is the economy, or is his words. And he's trying to explain the inverted yield curve and what it means. So we're going to get to that in a few minutes, but he's saying that what it means is that smart money is gloomy about economic prospects. Now, why would they be gloomy about economic prospects? So he's going through and he's saying, well, you have this. He says it's not just Trump. There's also troubles in China, recession brewing in Europe. It's not just Trump, but Trump is a very unpredictable figure, and his trade war stuff shows that he really has conviction here when it comes to trade and that this is not a good thing. And Krugman says that, for example, there's so much uncertainty about future trade policy that you can easily understand why manufacturers whose commercial relations involve international trade might hesitate to expand or even to start production because they just don't know what the future holds for them. So that's more or less Krugman's approach to this, is that he's saying that what we're seeing in the bond market is the smart money saying that Trumponomics has been a flop. Now, David, we want to go into this. You sent me an article of yours that we can talk about. But can you explain now? Take it down 3 notches from where you would normally explain it to a completely lay audience. What is the inverted yield curve, and why? What's the logic behind why it tends to portend recessions?
Well, the yield curve historically portended recession when the long rate fell under the short rate for, a reasonable period of time, 8 months, 15 months, 20 months. But I think all bets are off. History doesn't count any longer because we have financial conditions resulting from massive intrusion by the central banks that no longer really discount economic reality, or let's say the Main Street economy, but simply involve the massive speculation and distortions that are caused by the central banks owning 25 trillion of securities that they bought over the last 10 or 15 years, and thereby falsifying the price of almost everything. So when we look at the world today with 16 trillion of sub-zero debt, negative yielding government and corporate debt, or we look at cases in Europe like Germany in which the entire yield curve is below zero, or yesterday they actually priced a 30-year bond with a negative yield. This is something totally new under the sun. It's the bond market wreckage that has resulted from the massive central bank money printing that we've seen ever since the crisis in 2008, but really been going on for several decades now. So I don't think it means anything in terms of where the economy is going, this so-called inverted yield curve in the present circumstance, but it does point to a great deal of danger. In other words, we have to be very specific here when the yield on 10-year bonds or 5-year or 30-year bonds goes negative. It means you've driven the price of that bond way, way above par, right? That's the rule. Yield down, price up. So let's take a startling example that's in the market today, which I think listeners will quickly see what we're talking about. Austria issued 2 years ago a 100-year bond, which is kind of crazy because who knows if Austria will be around 100 years from now. But in any event, a 100-year bond with a 2% yield, hardly covering inflation or taxes. But within a year, the yield of that bond was down to 1%, and its price was up to 160%. In other words, it was trading at 60% above par for a bond that if it eventually matures way down the road 100 years from now, will pay back 100 cents. People were buying it for 160 cents. And then the Austrian government reopened the issue, sold another couple billion, and recently, a day or two ago, it was trading at 210% of par. This is just crazy. The yield was under 1%. The price of the bond was almost double its face value. That is nothing but rampant, crazy speculation that makes even some of the go-go stocks beyond meat and some of those at the moment look, modest by comparison. So this is what's going on in the bond market, the biggest speculative blow-off in history as traders are piling into these long-term bonds, believing that the central banks are going to go back into QE, quantitative easing, heavily again. And when they're buying, the German Bund or the U.S. Treasury 10-year or the Italian 10-year for that matter, it drives up the price, drives down the yield. And this is what we're facing in the world today. Now, my last point on this is it can't last. This is the mother of all bond bubbles. And when it reverses, because a lot of these bonds are being bought by speculators on repo and extreme leverage, when this bubble reverses, it will have devastating effects on the 100 trillion, bond market, corporate and government in the world today. So we're at a totally different and extremely dangerous ball game. And I think both sides of this yield curve, inverted yield curve, are missing the real picture, which again is the massive bond bubble that's right before our eyes.
You're going to have to forgive me here, David. I want to ask you this just as a man on the street. How can I understand why somebody would buy a 30-year bond with a negative yield? I mean, is it that I'm so pessimistic about the value of my money that I feel like if I don't buy this, even with the negative yield, I'll have an even more negative yield if I just stay in cash? I mean, what's behind that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, that's what the central bankers, the Keynesian central bankers want you to believe, or even, their megaphones, as I call them, on Wall Street. But it's a lot simpler than that. And I will go back to my Austrian bond. They're speculating on price. In other words, a bond is supposed to be a safe security that will redeem someday at par. You buy it at par, you get your money back, 100 cents in, 100 cents out. You collect a modest coupon in return, and you don't worry about, the bond defaulting or something like that. But what's happening right now is bond prices are rising so rapidly and so substantially that the usual suspects, the speculators who trade, who chase all these shooting stars and go-go stocks in the equity market are now in the bond market doing the same thing. As I said, that Austrian bond that I mentioned was trading at 160% of par in late June. A couple of days ago, it was 210%, which means in 2 months, a bond went up by, 30 or 40% in terms of its price. So they're just, it's all another case of the greater fool theory. I'll buy that negative yielding 30 or 100-year bond. The price today is 150. It's going to be 190 a couple months down the road. If anything starts to go wrong, I'll sell it to the next sucker, and get and pocket my capital gain and move on to something else. That is the very definition of a speculative mania that's nearing the blow-off stage. And that's happening in all of the sovereign bond markets of the world. 10 and 30-year bonds are being chased for price appreciation, and the buyers on the margin don't give a whit about what the yield is, because they're going for a 10% gain in the next 30 days or 15 days. And beyond that, which is important to understand, they're probably buying these bonds on repo, which means if you buy, let's say, $100,000 worth of bonds, you had to put up $5,000 worth of equity, and you borrowed a $95,000 in the repo market. And if the bond price goes up by 10, 20, 30%, like they're doing over the last few months, and you're on 9-to-1 leverage, you're making a killing. You're laughing all the way to the bank. This is what's going on right now, and it won't end well. We know that for sure.
Let's say a little something about Krugman's analysis here, because that is unfortunately a requirement of the podcast. There does seem to be something to Krugman's argument. In fact, let me read this one paragraph, just about the role that uncertainty coming from the Washington establishment, but he means Trump specifically, can play. And he says, think of the dilemma facing many U.S. manufacturers. Some of them rely heavily on imported parts. They're not going to invest in the face of actual or threatened tariffs on those imports. Others could potentially compete with imported goods if assured that those imports would face heavy tariffs, but they don't know whether those tariffs are actually coming or will endure. So everyone is sitting on piles of cash waiting to see what an erratic president will do. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that part I agree. I think that Trump's trade war is totally, misbegotten. It is one of the dumbest, most destructive, counterproductive policies to come out of Washington in my memory. I mean, it's every bit as bad as all the stupidity that Obama came up with, or all the bailouts that Bush before him undertook in the fall of 2008, or anything you can pin on Bill Clinton and go back from there. This is really bad, and because tariffs are bad generally because they end up penalizing the home economy more than the foreign malefactor that they're allegedly targeted at. But in this case, the economic relationship between China and the United States is so massive. We buy $550 billion a year from them, sell them $120 billion. So make it a rounded $700 billion two-way flow. And unlike all the protectionism in the past, in which you put up a tariff barrier and it covers the entire world, here we're creating this odd situation where there is a 10 and 25% tariff on most of that, or will be soon, most of that $550 billion, but it doesn't apply to Vietnam or to Cambodia or India or Mexico. So it's causing a massive turmoil and shuffling in global supply chains as suppliers attempt to deal with this massive tariff on one country oddity. Now, to some degree, U.S. importers are eating the tariffs. Some of them are being passed through to consumers. Some of them are being eaten by the Chinese suppliers because in the short run, they desperately need the revenue, even if they have to give up their profits. But slowly, a lot of this production is being moved, as I say, to Vietnam, Cambodia, Mexico, and elsewhere. It's oddly enough, the strangest foreign aid program ever conceived. Trump is really not bringing the effect of these tariffs is not to bring production back to the United States, because this is labor intensive production for the most part. It's just relocating it to Vietnam or Mexico or other low cost environments, and they're happy to take the business. But what is it doing for us? What is it doing for the American economy? It's simply disrupting the intricate, enormously complex supply chains that have built up all around the world. Now, let me say, Trump is on to the right thing. I do not believe that these massive trade deficits that we've had are benign. I don't buy this view that, well, foreigners love America so much they're happy to lend us infinite amounts of money so that we can run huge global trade deficits and current account deficits every year. I don't buy that. I blame that on bad money, not bad trade deals. And we're living way beyond our means because the Fed is making it possible by making debt so cheap that household sector can borrow and maintain a standard of living through borrowing rather than producing. But that isn't sustainable in the long run. So he addressed the right problem, but with the absolutely wrong solution or tools. And it is creating a massive snarl and, unfolding, ricocheting confusion in global trade that will affect the rate of growth, and I think ultimately trigger a technical or official recession.
I know, obviously, you've talked to us about what you think is going on in the bond market, but all the same, we have Krugman's analysis here that what he's seeing is either a rejection of or a signal of the failure of Trump economics, and that's what's going on here, that the smart money is saying Trump's economic policy is no good. So he's looking to get a partisan reading out of this. Do you think that just misses the boat, or is there anything there?
Yeah, but it's a different thing, okay? See, I think there never has been in the Main Street economy a Trump boom. This is all talking points. This is all cherry picking, certain indicators like a low U3 unemployment rate, and painting a picture that isn't warranted. The key thing is what's happening now is that we're in the late stages of a very long business expansion. In fact, at 121 months, it's now the longest in history, has exceeded even the 119-month expansion of the tech boom of the 1990s. And what Trump is boasting about is simply the positive numbers you get on unemployment or other indicators at the very end of a long cycle. I could point to the same thing in the 1960 cycle, where the unemployment rate was 3.7, 3.8. The same thing happened in 2000. In April 2000, the unemployment rate was 3.7%. The expansion at that point was nearly or more than 100 months old. The trailing numbers look very good. Bill Clinton back then was still in office. He could have boasted 4% real growth for the previous 16 quarters running. And yet, 9 months later, we were in a recession because it was at the very end of the cycle. Now, here's the truth of the matter. The business cycle has been grinding into old age, and there has been no acceleration in performance between the last years of the Obama administration and the first years of Trump. Neither had anything to do with what the economy is producing. That's the work of capitalism, workers and businesses and entrepreneurs and so forth. But nevertheless, just consider what the numbers actually are. During Trump's first 10 quarters in office through second quarter of 2019, real final sales, which is the best way to look at the GDP statistics. They're all flawed, but real final sales is the best one because you don't get the short run inventory fluctuations that can, allow people to distort, the trend by, picking a low number to start and a high number to end. But in any event, let me just look at real final sales. Under Trump, they're up 2.74% annualized during his 10 quarters in office. During the last 10 quarters of Obama, real final sales were up 2.87% annualized. So it's actually slowed down a tad. But the point is, neither Obama nor Trump can claim credit for either of those numbers. That's capitalism at work, pushing forward, growing because people want a better standard of living despite all the barriers and roadblocks that are being thrown in the way by Washington and the Fed and the state, as we call it generally. So the first thing is there wasn't an acceleration, there wasn't a boom, there was just capitalism marching forward into old age in terms of the business cycle. I could say the same thing about this flaky jobs numbers. As you know, I don't like the BLS numbers at all. They're so flawed it would take another whole discussion. But even if you want to use those, what you find is that during the first 31 monthly reports under Trump, the average new jobs added is 193,000. During the last 31 reports under Obama, it was 229,000. So again, it's just a business cycle grinding forward, slowing down as the accumulated barriers to growth caused by government, continue to rise. We got massive debt on the economy, 72 trillion public and private. We got massive speculation in Wall Street. We got all kinds of distortions because of false pricing in the financial markets. So the point is, there is no Trump boom. There is an aging business cycle that is very fragile, in my view, and all we have to have is some kind of black swan or orange swan, as the case may be, and this trade war may be it to throw the thing into another recession. And it'll not be a good show, because if the economy does slide into recession, and it's not really that far away if we look at what's really happening below the surface, there isn't any dry powder left for governments to come in and, rescue, turn around the economy on a dime. Interest rates are already 2%. There isn't much to cut. The deficit this year at the 10th year of a business cycle is going to be 1.1 trillion in the budget year upcoming. So, how are you going to stimulate, even if it's a good idea, which I don't think it is, but how are you going to have fiscal stimulus when you already have a structural deficit of that magnitude in place? So, that's what maybe there is a sense of all this coming together in the bond market. But I don't think the bond market is really telling you very much, except that there's a bunch of front runners front running the central banks of the world, the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, and the rest of them. But underneath, we have an economy that's laboring, struggling to keep moving forward from all of this nonsense that the government throws in the way.
David, one more thing before we wrap up. Obviously, we know that central bank manipulation can give people the impression of growth, and they can point to certain numbers that make it look like there's real growth, but it's not real growth, or it's not sustainable. It's phony in some way. What kind of metrics should we be looking at to be able to distinguish real growth from the counterfeit kind?
Well, I don't know if there's any good measure, but I do know that what I like to look at is how much is the debt growing versus how much is this so-called measured GDP growing. Now, let me just put let me put some data point on that, and I think the story will be clear. Remember, at the eve of the great financial crisis, late 2007, there was about 52 trillion of debt on the U.S. economy, public and private. That is, households, corporations, financial institutions, and government. And everybody at the time, we can all remember, said, well, we've overdone it. We've gone too far. We've tried to borrow ourselves into prosperity, and now we're suffering this massive trauma that occurred in 2008, 2009 when everything fell apart and the world was ending, and the Fed came back in and the other central banks of the world and doubled down on the same thing. Now, here we are 10 years later, roughly, and the total debt on the U.S. economy, no one delevered, no one, learned any lessons or changed direction. We now have 72 trillion of debt. All right. So what the U.S. economy did, everybody borrowing because the Fed made interest rates so low, as the government went crazy. We know that. Businesses went from 10 trillion to 15.5 trillion of debt, since the crisis. Households didn't delever at all. In fact, they added another trillion or so. So here's the key point. We've added 20 trillion of debt in a period in which we only got 5 trillion more GDP. So that tells you something, I think, very profound. And that is, how long can you keep doing that before, the whole thing really, goes to hell in a handbasket? And that's the metric I use. If debt is growing at 4 times the rate of so-called reported GDP, it's phony growth, it's unsustainable, and you're just digging yourself deeper into a real trauma down the road.
Well, David, I appreciate your joining me for this episode of Contra Krugman. I want to urge people to check out David Stockman's ContraCorner.com, where you'll get just top-notch analysis. Outstanding. David's most recent book, Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp and the Fantasy of MAGA. You can find that also linked at ContraKrugman.com/202. We'll link to David Stockman's Contra Corner there as well. Any final words or anything else you want to tell folks about regarding your activities or links or anything of the sort?
I think I appreciate you mentioning that, but, this is a uncharted water, a world that we're in today. I try to pay close attention to things going on, all around the planet, financial, political, fiscal, central banking, and that's really what we talk about on a very timely, topical basis each day in David Stockman's Contra Corner, and that is something you can find easily by Googling that name.
All right, David, thanks so much again. We appreciate it. And everybody, thanks very much. Bob Murphy will be back. We'll be doing our usual episodes next week. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Contra Krugman. Subscribe to the show for free on iTunes or Stitcher at ContraKrugman.com. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, our blog, books by Tom and Bob, and more at ContraKrugman.com. See you next week.
Like the sound of Contra Krugman? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at Podsworth.com.